Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 175. This time we've got a talk that's a few months old now by Craig Dalzell of the Commonweal talking about public finances in an independent Scotland. It explains a lot of the problems with GERS, and you might think he actually goes a bit soft on it, but that's not really the point. Here he talks about some of the things, apart from the methodology of GERS, that could easily be changed to instantly improve public finances in Scotland after independence. There's a funny part in there where he shows a graphic, which obviously you can't hear on a podcast, but there's just a sharp intake of breath and a Jesus Christ, which I think will probably explain more or less what the graphic says. Anyway, here's Craig's talk. Hope you enjoy it, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end.
We're ready. Right, you ready? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about ready, I think. Apologise. You ready? Yep. Everybody with us? Dorothy, you with us? Exactly as usual. Please don't. I'm not gonna ramble on. You know Craig. Craig can do all his own business. I just want to mention that we got David Kennedy at the back from the Senate Historical Society, something that was formed in the ESCOB, which I'm very proud of. Spend a couple of minutes with them, and you'll be surprised at some of the things that's been dealt with. I'll leave you with Craig. Give him a hard bloody time, please. I'm going to the back first. Enjoy. Thanks for coming, everybody, by the way. Including you, Dorothy.
Well, folk up the back, can you hear me if I'm talking at kind of this volume? That okay? That's good, because I'll strain my voice if I shout any louder. I've got another talk tomorrow, so I don't want to burn out. Well, thank you for having me back here. This is, I think, the third or fourth time I've been up to this particular in-group to chat about various aspects of the independence debate, so really glad to be back. Good to see a few faces I recognise, good to see a few faces I don't. Today, I'm going to be talking about the finances of independence. So that's always one of the big debates, isn't it? Probably one of the top three. Can we afford it? Are we too poor? I give the game away if I give the answer right now. You all know it. Especially, this talk will be based off one of my more prominent papers that I published in 2016 called Beyond GERS. Again, a few people have maybe heard about that or seen the debate around it. What I'm going to do is we're going to kick off just by talking about the finances of Scotland as we are right now and how we measure them. Because we're all familiar with GERS, aren't we? That annual self-flagellation in the news over how big our deficit is. So very, very briefly, GERS, the Government Expenditure and Revenue of Scotland, it's the annual accounting of how much revenue is raised in Scotland, plus a proportion of the UK spending, UK revenue that's allocated to us, minus the expenditure that happens in Scotland and the expenditure that happens for Scotland. Either our share of reserved functions or that benefit the entire UK, however you define any of the words in that sentence, or spending that is done on, say, reserved issues that is spent in Scotland, but it's not done by the Scottish Government. A lot of welfare is in that category. Very brief history of GERS, because there are a lot of myths and misconceptions and legends about it. It was set up in 1992 by Ian Lang, now Lord Lang, Conservative Secretary of State for Scotland. This was at the time when we were still debating devolution. We were right mired into that debate. GERS was constructed then specifically with the intent, we know this from subsequently disclosed memos, it was explicitly designed to undermine the devolution debate, to show that Scotland couldn't afford to take any control over its affairs. It's... Mice. They breed them big in Edinburgh. There were a lot of issues with the methodology around GERS at that time. Folk like Jim Cuthbert, the former Chief Statistician for Scotland, spent many years trying to get a campaign going in improving the methodology around GERS. Not much was done in the early years of independence independence, devolution. The Labour government, the Labour Lib Dem governments, they didn't really do much with the document. It wasn't really until 2007 when the SNP took control that they grasped this document and took on a lot of the recommendations for changing it and improving it. It's actually now fair to say that it offers a fair analysis of Scotland's finances as a region of the UK that has some devolved powers. There are still, maybe you can argue over bits around the edges, and statisticians always love to improve their methodology. I'm quite happy to keep on discussions with folk around that, but as it stands right now, it's certainly better than it was, and I'm quite happy to say that as a statement of devolved finances, it does a decent job. In fact, it's actually used now, the methodology underlying GERS is now used by the ONS for other regions of the UK, the English regions as well as Wales and Northern Ireland. But what does GERS not do? What does it not tell us? It does not model scenarios for an independent Scotland, because things change. Not just the policies that we might want to change with an independent Scotland, just the fact of independence changes a bunch of the assumptions over how finances are raised and spent in, for, by Scotland. So we can't just look at the figures in GERS, especially that bottom line deficit figure, and say, see, an independent Scotland will have a deficit of whatever that number is, because it won't. Things change. So I'm going to spend a wee bit of time tonight going through a few of those changes. One big one, and this is one where it does actually depend a little bit on policy, but it's policy that will have to change, is defence. Because it's quite plain to see that an independent Scotland will not have a defence sector that looks like a miniature UK sector. We're not going to have nukes. We're not going to have aircraft carriers. We're going to have different priorities. We're not going to have little islands somewhere in far-flung oceans where we've evicted all of the natives and sold land to give bases to America. The report the other week about from the UN stating that the UK was acting illegally over its behaviour in the Chagos Islands is damning. And if it had been any other state, I'm sure the UK would be condemning them.
Yes.
We can look at some of the chart up there is not great, I'm afraid. It's not that important, to be honest. Right now, Scotland spends around 3 billion on defence, or it's allocated about 3 billion in spending on defence. But as much as we can glean from very murky MOD figures, it looks like only about half of that is actually spent in Scotland. The rest of it is our share of the UK's bases elsewhere and other networks. So you can imagine an independent Scotland that decides to spend basically what it's already spending in Scotland, but just not spend on the stuff that's getting spent elsewhere. Instantly you've identified a £1.5 billion saving. We could go the other way though. We could say, as is the policy of some parties, that an independent Scotland wants to be a NATO member. They could say that we want to commit to the NATO's target of 2% of GDP. That would actually bring up the spending to about 3 billion. But if we then said, well, we're actually going to spend it on military kit, material and people in Scotland, well, if you pay wages, you have a bit of an economic boost because those soldiers would be spending money in Scotland. So actually, while that wouldn't increase Scotland's expenditure, it would actually increase their income by a few £100 million a year. It's a modest boost. It turns out that if you want to have an economic boost, spending on military matters is about the least efficient way of doing it. As you can see from the Trident debate. Or we could decide we want to be Scotland, the peacemaker, and take the approach that Ireland has. And we could cut spending on military to proportionate what Ireland spends. It would turn out to be about 700 million a year. Now that would be job losses in Scotland, but as I say, that's job opportunities for other sectors that maybe would have a bigger economic boost. Point is, pretty much all of the scenarios that you can imagine reasonably for Scotland in the defence sector, we'd be better off as an independent country. than as part of the UK, just in that purely financial terms. Another big one is the debt. The 2014 campaign, we went into that, we were talking about taking a share of the UK's debt and a share of the UK's assets. More recently, you've had groups like the SNP Growth Commission saying, well, we accept that actually the UK would own all of the UK's debt, but Scotland wouldn't have any, but we'd still pay £3 billion a year in interest payments to the UK to cover that debt perpetually. I completely disagree with that approach. That's maybe a talk for another night, though. A more reasonable approach is to take that half of that approach that the Growth Commission has taken, to accept that the rest of the UK, the remaining UK, has that full liability for all of the UK's debt. There's a good reason for this. That would allow the remaining UK to lay claim to being the continuing state to the former UK. In the same way that Russia claimed continuing status to the former USSR, similar to Russia, this allows the remaining UK to keep the UK's permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It also lets them keep intact various treaties and international agreements, like perhaps that Brexit deal that's currently being negotiated. Imagine having to start that from scratch. If we do that, then the UK lays claim to all of the mobile assets, and that are even the ones that are based in Scotland. And a lot of that is things like currency reserves, that's things like military equipment. So again, Scotland might want to have a claim on some of them, especially the currency reserves. If it wants some military equipment, depending on how we set up our defence system, see the previous slide there, we might want to lay claim on some of that kit. We probably don't want to lay claim on a proportional share of an aircraft carrier. They wouldn't float for a start. Even less chance of putting jets on it. But you can imagine then Scotland laying claim to some assets, negotiating that and mortgaging the value of those assets against the value of UK debt. That's a reasonable way of going about things, and that's actually an approach that many countries have done. If we do that, if we look at the reasonable assets that we've managed to identify that Scotland might want, what we find is we cut Scotland's interest payments from about $3 billion a year down to about $750 million a year. Turns out there's not a lot of assets that Scotland might need from the UK. It's worth noting that in these debt and asset negotiations, it only covers the mobile assets. Things like mineral rights get split up geographically. The rest of the UK will have no claim in Scotland's oil or its offshore renewable resources. Unfortunately, Scotland will have no claim on Cornish tin.
That's it over.
This is quite an important one here. I talked about the reserve powers that are where expenditure is done for Scotland, but not necessarily in Scotland. Imagine, for example, civil servants working in Whitehall for the Scotland office. Now, their income is a Scottish expenditure because the work that they're doing is for Scotland. But their income tax, because they're resident in England, will go into England's income revenue. When they go out to the shops and buy something, that VAT is English VAT. The increased demand in those shops results in increased profits, results in increased business rates and corporation tax for that shop. What we found that if we just try and look at the value of the amount of government work that is done for Scotland but outside Scotland, and we look at the value of repatriating that work to Scotland, not necessarily the Scotland office in its current form. Sorry, David Mundell.
Don't be sorry.
Then we've worked out that we could be looking at somewhere in the region of £1.3 billion in additional revenue for Scotland per year. It's quite a significant boost to the Scottish economy just by bringing our government back. And this is one of the things that kind of gets me about the GERS debate. If Denmark moved a good chunk of its government to London and started looking at its finances the way we look at